I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Eugenie Scott, who's an expert on the creationism and evolution controversy and science denialism. The former director of the National Center for Science Education, she's the recipient of numerous awards from scientists and educators and has been awarded 10 honorary degrees. For those who are interested in the heavens, she's also got an asteroid 249540 Eugenie Scott named after her, but she assures us it's not pointed at us. I have the pleasure of opening the floor to Dr. Scott. Thank you very much for coming in to talk to us today.
Well, you're certainly welcome, Matt. Thank you very much for inviting me. The Scopes trial is a really good story, and it's full of colorful characters, plot twists, and everybody likes a good story. If you've never heard of the Scopes trial, it was the trial of a young school teacher, John Scopes, who was tried for violating a new Tennessee state law that forbade the teaching of evolution. The defense and the prosecution were represented by celebrity lawyers William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow. This made the trial a huge cultural event and hugely relevant to the history of religion, science, politics, education, and press coverage of celebrities. Details to come. It took place in 1925, but Scopes is still relevant because many issues raised in 1925 were never completely resolved. But let's talk about the fun Scopes trivia first. First is the typical interpretation of the Scopes trial is the triumph of modernism over fundamentalism, the triumph of evolution and science over superstition and ignorance. Well, not really. Scopes lost. He was prosecuted under the Butler Act, which stayed on the books until 1976. And far from being a triumph of evolution over fundamentalist biblical literalism, two additional states passed anti-evolution laws after the trial. What we know as the modern fundamentalist movement, with its colleges and radio stations and publications, arguably began after and perhaps because of the Scopes trial. Similarly, there was more evolution in textbooks before the Scopes trial than after. Teachers were anxious to avoid controversy and thus avoided evolution. As I say, details to follow. There's a lot of fun stuff about Scopes himself. He was hired to coach football and, by the way, physics and math, which was pretty standard for the time. Football was much more important in Tennessee than in the academic subjects. He was the plaintiff in the Scopes. Not the plaintiff. He was the defendant in the Scopes trial, but he never took the stand during his trial. The lawyers knew he didn't know much about evolution and didn't want him asked questions he couldn't answer. In fact, it's quite likely he never actually even taught evolution. Later in life, in 1943, he ran for Congress on the socialist ticket. His father was a friend of Norman Thomas's, and John campaigned for him. Neither of these socialists did well in the election, getting less than 1%. Scopes joked that he got about 9 votes, which was about the number of eligible relatives I had in the day. Although he avoided publicity most of his life and refused to cash in on his fame after. In 1960, he appeared on the popular TV show To Tell the Truth. Raise your hand if you've ever watched To Tell the Truth. I know some hands are going up out there, even though that was a television show from my and many of your youth, for sure. One of the other 2 contestants claimed to be named Darrow, and the other claimed to be named William Jennings Bryan, which may possibly have been true. I don't know. And don't you just love the way that the women wore evening clothes on this afternoon quiz show, this quiz show? Sweatpants seem to be the rigor these days, but whatever. On to other Scopes trivia. Scopes' sister, Leela Scopes, lost a high school teaching job because she wouldn't renounce her brother's ideas. She was proud of it, and that he stood up for what he believed. There are even better stories about the legal teams. Dayton is a small town. H.L. Mencken described it as having 2 paved streets, which might have been a little bit of an exaggeration. But in any regard, as a small town, it didn't have a lot of young people in it. Scopes was quite friendly with a young lawyer named Sue Hicks, and they double dated. Well, Hicks happened to be on the prosecution legal team and very cheerfully persecuted his good friend John. Sue Hicks was named for his mother, who died a short time after birth. He was arguably the inspiration for the song A Boy Named Sue. Joel Silverstein had heard of Sue Hicks in the late 1960s, and he wrote a poem which he gave to Johnny Cash, who, of course, turned it into a song, and it was a huge hit. At the time, Hicks was a Tennessee judge, and Cash sent him 2 copies of the autographed albums there, writing, "To Sue, how do you do?" Hicks had a sense of humor, and he thought it was pretty funny. There were characters on both legal teams, certainly, but Scopes' team had the winner by a mile. John Randolph Neal, who recently had been fired from the University of Tennessee Law School, he is most charitably described as eccentric, I think. He allegedly rarely bathed and didn't bother to grade the law school students' papers and exams, which is probably instrumental in him losing his job. But another lawyer on Scopes' team was quite prominent, and then went on to be an actor in Hollywood. Dudley Field Malone. Definitely more on him later. He had his greatest success playing Winston Churchill in Mission to Moscow and An American in Paris. You can probably see why. Scopes' post-trial life had its ups and downs. David Starr Jordan, and hey, in the Bay Area, I don't need to tell people who David Starr Jordan was, so that's good. At Stanford, organized scientists to raise money so that Scopes could attend graduate school in geology at the University of Chicago. But they didn't raise enough for a PhD. So partway through, he applied for a fellowship. Now, his professor recommended him. He was an excellent student, showed great promise. But the Chicago president equated evolution with atheism and turned him down, telling him, "You can take your atheistic marbles and play elsewhere." It was one of many negative consequences of his being plaintiff in the trial of the century. So Scopes dropped out of graduate school for lack of money and went to work in the Venezuelan oil fields as a geologist. Although all his life he wanted to teach, no school would hire him. He thought correctly because of the trial. Let's return to the Scopes trial itself. The precipitating event was the legislature's passage in March of 1925 of the Butler Act, which, and I quote, forbade the teaching of any doctrine that, quote, denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Well, what led up to this anti-evolution attitude? Historians point to 4 factors. First, fundamentalist religion. Fundamentalism is actually not very old as religious movements go. It was inspired by the commissioning and distribution of a series of 12 pamphlets called the Fundamentals of Christianity, in other words, which were written as recently as 1910 to 1915. This is not an old kind of Christian theology. It's a fairly new one. Protestant fundamentalism proclaimed the Bible was inerrant, but inerrancy slid over to biblical literalism fairly quickly, and most fundamentalists interpret the Bible literally. Well, evolution is, in fact, not compatible with the literal interpretation of Genesis, though many other Christians have no problem with evolution. But it didn't take long before fundamentalists rejected evolution. Many socially progressive thinkers also associated evolution, particularly evolution by natural selection, with the evils of social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism is a misinterpretation of Darwinian natural selection theory promoted by laissez-faire capitalists like Andrew Carnegie. They justified sweatshops, child labor, exploitation of workers, etc., as being natural and therefore good. Unsurprisingly, people who cared about the welfare of their fellow human beings opposed evolution along with opposing capitalism. As if the evils of unfettered capitalism weren't bad enough, evolution was also associated with a truly evil idea, eugenics. Francis Galton read On the Origin of Species and was inspired to develop ideas about the betterment of human species through selective breeding of the more fit. Galton, by the way, was Darwin's cousin, what came to be called eugenics. Eugenics was also conflated with evolution and natural selection, so that was another reason to oppose evolution. A fourth reason was the appalling devastation and carnage of World War I, the Great War. Before World War I, the Germans had been considered the epitome of science, culture, modernism, industrialism, yet they were accused of the most appalling atrocities. It seemed to many that civilization itself had gone awry. Supposedly, Germans were enamored with evolution, although that is strongly debatable. But in any event, people tied evolution with World War I atrocities, etc. The Great War created a lot of cultural angst, and a supposed German embrace of evolution was swept up in this angst. There were plenty of reasons to oppose the teaching of evolution, the religious ones certainly, but also secular ideas, some of them confusing the science of evolution with misinterpretations like social Darwinism or eugenics, or not entirely accurate history about World War I. So the anti-evolution movement got going largely after the publication of the Fundamentals and after World War I. The leader of this anti-evolution movement was a famous progressive politician, William Jennings Bryan. An historian commented that a player gets judged by his last innings. So Bryan is judged by the Scopes trial, but his life was much more complex. Bryan was one of the most famous and beloved politicians of the day. He was tall, he was handsome, good-looking guy. And what an orator. He could move masses of people with his very words. The great commoner had served as a congressman. He'd been Wilson's Secretary of State and had run for president and lost 3 times. So he was very prominent, very well known, and very well liked by the public. He was called the Great Commoner because of his faith in ordinary people. He stood for policies that are taken for granted these days, but which were radical during the Gilded Age. For example, who knew women should have the right to vote? Workers should not have to work more than an 8-hour day without overtime. Children should be in school, not working in factories. Imperialism is bad. Corporations should not finance campaigns. Too bad that one didn't stick. Senators should be elected by popular vote. Government should serve the people, not bankers and industrialists. Guess that one didn't stick either. Many other progressive policies, many of which Bryan helped Wilson get through Congress. It's a pretty darn good list. But lest one get too warm and fuzzy about Bryan, though, like many intellectuals of his day, he was also a eugenicist and believed in the superiority of the white race. Late in life, he devoted his last innings to campaigning for prohibition and promoting Christianity and opposing evolution. And much of his former contribution was forgotten. I feel like Bryan has really gotten a bum rap in most of history today. The historian Ed Larson describes him as promoting left-wing politics and right-wing religion. Like most conservative Christians, he accepted that the earth was old, not 6,000 years. And although he did believe God created humans specially, he was open to the idea that other species could have evolved. Now, Bryan didn't like evolution, but it wasn't just that it didn't affect the literal interpretation of Genesis, the 6 24-hour days. He was a social gospel Christian, and he associated evolution with these, evil ideologies like social Darwinism and which are views that the robber barons definitely embraced and used them to exploit workers, eugenicists and so forth. Which these ideas are really not compatible with social gospel Christianity. So the Butler Act reflected its times. When it was passed, fundamentalists rejoiced, and there was a general uproar from the more secular community. The American Civil Liberties Union had been founded only 5 years previously in 1920, and it was trying to make a name for itself. To the ACLU, the Butler Act was an attack upon free speech and freedom of thought, so they looked for a plaintiff. The ACLU took out advertising in some Tennessee newspapers promising they would defend any teacher willing to bring a test case against the Butler Act. Enter the smallish, about 1,800 souls, town of Dayton, about midway between Knoxville and Chattanooga. It was a relatively new town and the county seat of Ray County. But it didn't have a strong economic base anymore. The coal mines were largely played out and the town had lost population. A transplanted New Yorker living in Dayton, mining engineer George Rapelier, read the ACLU advertisement in the Chattanooga Times and came up with the idea that if they could find a plaintiff in Dayton to challenge the Butler Act, Dayton would get a lot of publicity. A trial in Dayton would produce a Chautauqua-like atmosphere, and it would bring commerce to the region. And, it's a little rundown town. This would be a really great thing. Rapelier convinced some others and got general agreement that this would be a good publicity stunt. Meeting at Robinson's drugstore, the conspirators mused over who could they get to be the plaintiff. Had anyone actually taught evolution at the one high school in town? Well, there weren't a lot of choices. There's only one high school and not very many teachers. They soon settled on an amiable 24-year-old science and math teacher and part-time football coach, John Scopes. They sent a runner to get him from the tennis court to meet them at Robinson's drugstore and asked him, "So, how do you feel about the Butler Act?" Well, Scopes had gone to the University of Kentucky for his undergraduate degree, and he really admired how the science faculty and the president had stood up to the Kentucky legislature when they had attempted to pass an anti-evolution bill previously. So, yeah, he was on board with opposing the law. Had he actually broken the law by teaching evolution? He was a math and physics teacher. Well, he had substituted for the biology teacher for a couple of weeks when the biology teacher got sick, and he had used the state-approved textbook, and the state-approved textbook included biology, and he would have had to have reviewed it for the final exams, and it included evolution. So arguably he had taught evolution, or at least was evolution adjacent. It was a most cordial dress and arraignment. This picture is a reenactment of the meeting at Robinson's drugstore with attorney Herbert Hicks sitting next to Scopes. Herbert's brother and Scopes' friend Sue Hicks is in back. Notice all the hats. That's so great. I love this here. Rapelier got a justice of the peace to swear out a warrant for Scopes' address. He gave it to a constable to serve Scopes, who was sitting right there. And Scopes was officially arrested and arraigned for violating the law. And then he thanked everybody cordially and went back to his tennis game. Rapelier then called the ACLU and told them they had a plaintiff. The publicity stunt was well on its way. So the county prosecutor, Herbert Hicks, and his brother, Sue Hicks, began to assemble a legal team. They added Walter White, conservative Republican and superintendent of schools, after some complaints from locals that the Hicks brothers wouldn't be tough enough. And the chief prosecutor would be Tom Stewart as attorney general of the district. Stewart was a pretty competent guy. But things rapidly changed when the great commoner volunteered to lead the prosecution. The defense was also getting organized. The aforementioned hygiene-challenged John Randolph Neal showed up on Scopes' doorstep and said, "Boy, I'm interested in your case. Whether you want me or not, I'm going to be here." Well, they needed local counsel, and so Scopes chose him. ACLU's Arthur Garfield Hayes was a very competent lawyer, and he also joined the team, and there were a few others who were cycled in and out. But these were largely eclipsed by the announcement that since Brian was going to be the star of the prosecution team, the mighty Clarence Darrow would be there for the defense. Clarence Darrow was a Chicago attorney who had worked for the same populist causes that Brian worked for, like trade unions and worker rights, economic reform, women's suffrage, freedom of thought, etc. Although Brian and Darrow shared a lot, they parted over the U.S. entry into World War I and over temperance. Darrow is thought to be one of, if not the best, trial attorneys of the 20th century. He is legendary. He brought in Dudley Field Malone, the fellow I mentioned before who looked like Churchill. Malone was a lefty New York political reformer, a Democrat, a very successful divorce lawyer, which was a little bit touchy in central Tennessee, another supporter of women's suffrage, and an anti-war activist who was a highly competent lawyer. Malone gave what both sides agreed was the most powerful speech of the entire trial on the topic of academic freedom. And it's online if somebody would be interested in reading it, and it's really good. Now, Malone is almost always pictured like you see him here, in a full suit and tie. It is hotter than blue blazes in central Tennessee in July. Trust me on this. I've been there more than once. And the judge basically gave permission to the other lawyers and anybody else in the courtroom to take off their jackets and their ties, which was not protocol, but was hotter than blue blazes in there, and they really needed to do it. So before he gave his big speech, he carefully took off his jacket, folded it neatly on the table behind him, and immediately got everybody's attention. This guy knew how to work a crowd. Seriously, though, both Brian and Darrow agreed that Malone was the most effective lawyer in the trial. Neither side wanted their respective celebrities. Each feared that Brian and Darrow would hijack the case to support their own causes, and each side was absolutely correct. Now, the ACLU wanted a narrow trial about whether a law that restricted an academic subject for religious reasons was legal. Narrowly interpreted, the Butler Act merely forbade a teacher from teaching a view that denies the story stated in the Bible. Since there's more than one creation story in the Bible, who's to say that Scopes contradicted the Bible? And further, because evolution was good science, not teaching it would be irrational. And requiring someone to behave irrationally violates due process. Now, the due process argument is related to an academic freedom argument. Scopes had academic freedom, they say, to teach state-of-the-art science scholarship, in this case, to teach evolution. Further, the defense argued that the Butler Act was unconstitutional because it bent instructions to fit the Bible, which was a freedom of religion issue. Darrow didn't disagree, but village atheist that he was, he couched the argument in terms of freedom of conscience about religion. He argued that making the Bible the arbiter of what is true and what can be taught is not only an unconstitutional establishment of one religious view, but it's an assault on freedom of thought and conscience. He said, "We are marching backwards to the glorious age of the 16th century, when bigots lighted faggots to burn men, dared to bring any intelligence and enlightenment and culture to the human mind." No slouch of oration, this guy either. The prosecution lawyers also wanted a narrow case. Stewart and Bryan would argue that the state had the authority to tell teachers what to do because the state paid for education. He who pays the piper calls the tune. Their position was that the case against Scopes didn't have anything to do with religion. Now, of course, Bryan would throw that narrow focus right out the window because his issue was religion. And even if asserting the state's authority over curriculum was important, Bryan also wanted to defend his version of Christianity against modernist versions that accepted evolution. To support their theory that evolution wasn't intrinsically anti-Bible, the defense planned to have a series of noted theologians and scientists, all, by the way, scientists or theologians, all religious, explain what evolution was, and argue that there was no necessary conflict between evolution and Christianity. Prosecution also wanted to call expert witnesses to claim that evolution was scientific claptrap, but this was a problem. First, scientists that didn't accept evolution were pretty few on the ground. The few he could find weren't available or weren't sufficiently anti-evolutionary for Bryan's purposes. The most famous anti-evolutionist of the day, Seventh-day Adventist George McReady Price, founder of flood geology, if you know anything about modern-day creation science. This is the guy. He was lecturing in England, so he wasn't available, but he didn't want to do it anyway. So since the prosecution couldn't counter the defense witnesses, they asked the judge to strike the defense witnesses. And the judge was persuaded to stick to the narrower legal issues and forego testimony on evolution's scientific bona fides. The scientific witnesses dictated their testimonies, left them with the court, never got to testify, they went home. But because expert witnesses were ruled out, one of the most dramatic events of this or any other trial occurred. If Darwin couldn't bring in scientific expert witnesses, he proposed to interview an expert on religion, William Jennings Bryan. This was a hugely audacious move that you can imagine the prosecution lawyers just hit the fan. I mean, no, absolutely not, absolutely not. This is crazy. You don't interview a lawyer from the other side. But Brian, he was not known for his uh, small ego. Brian was perfectly willing and actually anxious to face off against the great atheist, Darrow. And the judge said, fine. I mean, by this time, the Scopes trial had been such a circus anyway. The judge probably figured, why not? And besides, it'll be really interesting to see these two guys go at it. Because it was such a hot day, the judge had moved the trial outside under the shade of trees. So literally hundreds of people witnessed this extraordinary event. Brian is sitting there on the left, Darrow is standing on the right. Now, Darrow's goal was to make Brian look out of touch and even foolish if he could, and he did. Darrow asked Brian about the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. I remember from reading the Bible that it says that God lengthened the day by stopping the sun so that Joshua could win the battle. Now, you can only lengthen the day by stopping the sun if you live in a geocentric universe. And Brian wasn't going to be painted a geocentrist. So Brian prevaricated a bit, and Darrow followed up by asking if perhaps God stopped the Earth. Of course, this would get Brian in trouble, not only with astronomy, but also with physics and geology. So Brian was going to lose no matter what he did. And questioning went on like this about the age of the Earth, the literal interpretation of the days of creation, the flood of Noah, where Cain and Abel got their wives, and on and on. Darrow trapped Brian into admitting that the Bible had to be interpreted, could not be taken literally. The audience gasped. This was not something they expected from William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was an educated man. He didn't want to get caught, and maybe more importantly, since he represented the state of Tennessee get caught denying modern science, which would destroy his and everybody else's credibility. But of course, a biblical literalist interpretation of Genesis is not compatible with modern science. So Bryan did not come off very well in this exchange, which newspapers reported all over the country. However, this most famous element of the trial was held without the jury being present. On the next day, which was day 7 of the jury was called back in. They had missed most of the trial, and the defense essentially said, yeah, go ahead and convict him. We'll appeal it and we'll win on appeal. The jury convicted Scopes after a deliberation of all of 9 minutes. The judge assigned a penalty of $100, and the trial of the century was over. Now, there's a lot more to be told about appeals and what happened to people after the trial, but our friend John Randolph Neal screwed up a number of the filings and arguably messed up the appeal. But there's a lot of more fun stuff that went on in the trial. But let's move on to the significance of the trial. I think Scopes' trial is a good story. It's got a powerful cast. It has interesting plot twists and lots of digressions that make for fun facts. If nothing else, you'll probably remember the origin of a boy named Sue. But Scopes, I think, is relevant beyond its intrinsic interest as a good story. Recall the old adage that history doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. First, it was indeed the trial of the century. It set the template for the coverage of crime stories and other public events. It also has relevance for education, particularly the teaching of evolution and, spoiler, the battle isn't over. Evolution and anti-evolution became identified with sides or groups. The position you took was largely determined by what tribe you identified with, and this is something we wrestle with today. Finally, although this is not an exhaustive list, the Scopes trial led directly to the growth of Christian fundamentalism as a political force in the 20th and early 21st centuries. So, why do I say that Scopes was the trial of the century? For starters, consider communications. The Scopes trial was the first trial ever broadcast live on that hot new medium, radio. Radio was the cutting edge technology of the time, and radios were slowly becoming common household items. Chicago radio station WGN had a series of microphones. Here's one in the slide there, dinner plate, set up around the courtroom and out in overflow areas so the listening public could hear all of the details. WGN also had a huge broadcast range that covered most of the Midwest. The ability to cover a trial live set a standard for future press coverage and sensationalism. Thousands of miles of telegraph and telephone lines were strung from Chattanooga to Dayton, so they estimated 200 reporters. Remember, this is a teeny little town, 200 reporters alone, so they could get out their stories. The Civic Boosters meeting in Robinson's drugstore had wanted publicity, but like I said before, they were sort of thinking of an intellectual Chautauqua-like experience, but that's not what they got. People would visit Dayton out of curiosity. They would attend talks and lectures and boost the economy of the town. Not really. What they got instead was a sideshow. The circus atmosphere was obvious from the first day. People came from all over. Reporters came from pretty much all the major newspapers. Street preachers and Bible sellers lined the downtown. Prayer meetings were organized. Hucksters and salespeople lined the streets of Dayton. It became a huge media, political, and cultural event with even a trained chimp making an appearance. And let's not forget the role of celebrity. Brian and Darrow were two of the most famous people of their time. It's no wonder that people listened to the radio or snapped up newspapers and magazines to read about the exchanges as soon as they were published. It was a huge news story. It had strong contrasting characters, and it dealt with serious political, social, and cultural issues. What is the role of the state versus academic freedom and education? Can science be balanced with religion? What about varying opinions about evolution within Christianity, which is needed to be addressed? Because fundamentalists do not have the only view of evolution within Christianity. Similarly, the modernist fundamentalist rift was growing as fundamentalism grew in American Protestant Christianity. And of course, since it had to do with evolution and religion, there also were existential issues like what does it mean to be human? What is the meaning and purpose of life, etc. African Americans didn't take a uniform stand on evolution, but the Black press noted that while America was fixated on evolution, many more important issues needed addressing. Cartoon shows Uncle Sam pointing out that public interest was ignoring the important issues like racism, lynching, Jim Crow, and poverty in the South to focus on the relatively unimportant issue of evolution. He says, "Say, Doc, you're just wasting time on that kid. He never gives me a bit of trouble. Here's the brat that raises all the cane." There's so many wonderful Scopes cartoons, by the way. If you ever really get into this, you'd have fun. Big issues provided lots of opportunities for press hyperbole. Immediately after the Scopes trial, there wasn't a consensus of opinion about its significance. And it really wasn't until after about 1930 that a consensus developed that fundamentalism had been discredited, and that even though Scopes lost his case, his cause had won. To a fair degree, this framing of the Scopes trial is reflected in the 1955 play Inherit the Wind. In 1960, Spencer Tracy and Frederick March starred in the most famous movie version, and it has been remade for television 3 times. How many of you have seen Inherit the Wind? I bet there's a bunch of hands that do go up there too. It is a terrific play if you get a chance to see it. And of course, the Tracy Frederick March movie is always on everybody's 100 best movies list. But there are significant differences between the real trial and Inherit the Wind. Inherit the Wind is not a very good reflection of the Scopes trial. Not only is it very different in terms of plot, but the characters. William Jennings Bryan was far more sophisticated and much less of a religious fanatic than Matthew Harrison Brady, for example. The authors of the play explained that they were really interested in freedom of thought and freedom of conscience and freedom of speech, and that the play was not an allegory about creation. Wow. the message of the story was really anti-McCarthyism, 1955, right? But the press had a huge role in framing our memories of big events like trials of the century. So this is the legacy of Scopes in the coverage of future crime trials, all of which I assure you will also be called the trial of the century. New media provides opportunity to reach a wider audience in different ways. During Scopes, it was radio and newspaper reporters using the telegraph. Later trials have a different media configuration. In the case of O.J. Simpson, it was television, live television. Celebrity brings an irresistible dimension to crime trial coverage. Issues important to society are being raised, and these factors increase the popularity of the event and thus the competition among the press to shape the story, with the prevailing story not always being the most accurate. My prediction is that the next trial of the century will feature as the prime medium not radio or television, but the much more diverse universe of the internet, especially social media. Already, a large percentage of people report their primary source of news is social media, and this tendency is especially strong in younger people. The amateur world of podcasters, TikTokers, YouTubers, and other, quote, influencers, let's face it, untrained in actual reporting, but having nonetheless acquired a probably undeserved reputation of independence and trustworthiness, is being turned to for factual knowledge. And the results are going to be interesting in the sense of may you live in interesting times. Let me talk a bit about the relevance of the Scopes trial to education, especially the present day teaching of evolution. Now, I'm going to skimp a bit, actually, because I've spoken a lot about the creationism evolution controversy, and not only my views, but those of other NCS personnel on the creation evolution controversy and its history are available on NCSE's YouTube site. And anybody who wants to have more depth on this, what I consider a very interesting issue, please do avail yourself of these other resources. In his effort to ban evolution, Brian made 3 points. He attacked the science of evolution. He claimed that evolution was incompatible with religion, and also, which was the pillar of the prosecution's theory of the case, is that citizens, rather than experts, should determine what children should learn. And these are exactly the positions taken by modern creationists. But today's creationists use different approaches than those of 1925. So let me look briefly at the history of anti-evolutionism since Scopes. There's a useful taxonomy used at NCSE to summarize the major periods in the history of anti-evolutionism. Banning, of course, is the Scopes era and immediately following. Balancing evolution came about after evolution returned to the classroom after educational reforms of the 1950s and 60s. Anti-evolutionists promoted the idea that evolution should be balanced by the teaching of creation science and then later balanced by the teaching of intelligent design. Legal decisions eventually drove these out of the classroom, although both are still around and would be more than happy to return. The failure to balance evolution with a form of creationism led to a shift in strategy of blunting the teaching of evolution by requiring it to be taught as just a theory in the colloquial sense of it's just a guess. It's just your theory, theory buster, nothing you take seriously, as opposed to the way scientists use the word theory, which is theory is a really, really big deal. Or they will propose that students should, yes, learn evolution, but learn the evidence against evolution as well. But of course, the only evidence against evolution you will find is that in creationist sources. And it's pretty bad science. They also will contend that teachers should teach controversy as if scientists were actually debating whether evolution took place. And this continues, but there appears to be a new era upon us, backsliding, beginning with a 2022 Supreme Court decision, Kennedy versus Bremerton. Now, you might remember this. This is the case of the praying football coach who sued for his right to pray on the 50-yard line after games. In the course of striking down the two lower courts, the Supreme struck down the precedent that has been used since the 1970s to keep creationism out of the science classroom, a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman. So now there basically is no accepted jurisprudence for citing Establishment Clause cases. The justices in this decision spoke vaguely of history and tradition, which sound to be very, well, I use the word vague, that's adequate. I would encourage you to read Justice Sotomayor's dissent if you want to see the legal equivalent of using a blowtorch to peel paint from the walls. She was not pleased with it. The demise of Lemon could open the door to new efforts by creationists to compromise the teaching of evolution. Another possibility for a concern about backsliding is an even more recent legal decision, Mahmoud versus Taylor. Mahmoud versus Taylor is a case about parents' rights to opt out students from instruction for religious reasons. Specifically, in this case, it was exposure to LGBTQ storybooks in elementary school. But as Justice Sotomayor replied in her dissent, next to go could be teaching on evolution, work of female scientist Marie Curie, or the history of vaccines. Whether opting out for religious reasons applies to academic subjects is unknown. What we do know is that legislation since Kennedy versus Bremerton has reflected all of these approaches except banning. And the bold-faced bills in this slide are bills that have actually passed. Some of these are balancing bills that flat out call for the teaching of creationism or ID, intelligent design. Some of these bills call for blunting evolution by teaching it as theory, not fact, or evidence for and evidence against evolution. Backsliding is reflected in the Wisconsin so-called parental rights bill, which requires teachers to inform parents, quote, when a controversial subject will be discussed, in order to allow parents to opt out their kids for religious reasons. Now, the Wisconsin bill preceded Mahmoud versus Taylor, but more parental rights bills are being submitted every year. By the way, that Wisconsin parental rights bill was vetoed by Governor Tony Evers, who is a former teacher and knew better than to sign it. Usually these parental rights bills refer to issues of race or gender or healthcare or history. But why not evolution? Why not climate change? These are controversial issues. We are not sure how Mahmoud is going to be interpreted, but I think it's time to buckle up. This 1925 cartoon asks the Brian Darrow in Evolution, when shall we three meet again? I guess the answer is that when it comes to education, it never really parted. Okay, let me move on to the last two reasons why I think Scopes is still relevant. Let's look at the tribalization of science. In 1925, if you considered yourself a religiously and culturally conservative Christian, you were against evolution, whether you knew anything about the science or not. If you were more secular and belonged to a non-literalist Christian denomination or were agnostic or a non-believer, well, you thought it should be taught, whether you knew anything about the science or not. Scopes remind us that even scientific ideas get run through a filter of ideology. Not all ideas. No one is campaigning to have photosynthesis removed from the curriculum. But photosynthesis does not have consequences for someone's values or beliefs, and many other subjects like evolution do. And that's the takeaway. The heart of opposition to contentious issues is people's values, their ideology, and their identification with social groups, their tribes. Scopes underscores that when scientific ideas have consequences for strongly felt views, for ideological positions or values, these consequences can cause the science to be rejected, regardless of how solid the science is. And this is something we see in abundance today. In the case of Scopes, the ideology primarily was religious and continues to be religious. The way people who belong to certain religious traditions believe that is that if evolution is true, then the Bible is false. And if the Bible is false, there's no salvation, there's no guide for good behavior. We will all hell in a handbasket. Evolution was also tarred with social Darwinism. The liberal tribe believed that if evolution was true, then there's no use fighting against eugenics or better working conditions or for better working conditions. You are battling nature. If you wanted people to have a better life, evolution could not be. When science has consequences for ideologies, values, or our social relationships, it is only natural that we look carefully at it. And we should not be surprised that people are resistant to accepting scientific views or historical or other views that require a change in their values or ideology or the abandonment of their social identifications. I don't believe that ideologies or values are bad per se. We social primates live in groups, we identify with other people, we form tribes holding mutual values and interests. This is how humans are wired, and it's probably adaptive. Being motivated by your values isn't necessarily bad. This is how humans are wired. Some values and ideologies lead to positive results, some to negative. Problem for both science as well as everyday life is when ideology, values, or social identification prevents someone from considering empirical evidence that might conflict with them. Overcoming that very human tendency is one of the hardest things we have to do, and most people do not do it very well. It's called confirmation bias, and it affects us all. There are many public controversies over science where the science is strong and well accepted, but which are rejected by portions of the public. Not because of the quality of the science, though that is often claimed, but primarily because of the consequences of the science for certain worldviews. It's the motivation for confirmation bias. If you're right, then I lose big, so you can't possibly be right. The important ideology for evolution is religion, but ideologies are different. Climate change, GMO rejection, or vaccine rejection. Just to take climate change as an example, attitudes toward climate change held by Republicans and Democrats differ substantially. Democrats are much more likely than Republicans to accept climate change, be concerned about it, and vote for candidates that support action to slow it down. And this is shown in survey after survey. In this case, political group identification shapes the attitude toward science. For GMOs, the issue is not religion or politics, but other values and beliefs, which vary by country. Rejection of GMOs in Europe is a lot stronger than here in the US. GMO rejection falls into a few categories. Safety. Is eating frankenfoods, as they are described, safe for people and livestock? Is it safe? Yes. Is it safe for the environment? Are animals that are modified genetically harmed or suffering? Some GMO pushback is economic, the belief that big pharma, that's spelled with an F, you see, is out to exploit the public and especially farmers and farm workers for financial gain. There's also a purity component. GMO foods are considered to be contaminated, especially those involving genes from different species, which, by the way, is not all that common in GMO. Another belief is that GMOs are unnatural. Putting genes from one species into another is considered highly unnatural, but even speeding up natural selection is unnatural and playing God. An example of the last two is a story that refuses to die, which is that tomatoes now have fish genes because an antifreeze protein from a fish was introduced to tomatoes to make them more cold tolerant. Now, there were experiments like this, but the project was never completed because the antifreeze protein didn't work very well in tomatoes. So these tomatoes never made the market, but this has become an urban legend. There's other reasons for rejecting GMOs as well, although these are the major categories. It's not because the science is wrong and inaccurate, but because of values held. Finally, we come to the last reason I think Scopes is relevant. According to the historian Adam Latz, the present-day strength of the conservative Christian fundamentalist movement can be laid directly at the foot of the Scopes trial. And here I am really going to abbreviate a topic that is worth much more detail. In his book, Fundamentalism and Education in the Scopes Era, God, Darwin, and the Roots of America's Culture Wars, Adam Latz argues that the seeds for many of today's culture wars were sown during the Scopes era, the 20s and the 30s. During and after the Scopes trial, fundamentalists were shocked that not everyone agreed with them. I guess they were a little bit insular, but they were very surprised that these ideas were not widely shared among the American public. They were doubly stung at the stereotype created of them and other Southerners by press coverage, which presented them as ignorant, backward hicks. Didn't have time to talk about H.L. Mencken, but boy, he was pretty rough. Fundamentalists weren't just concerned about evolution, though. Their goal really was to establish their form of Protestant Christianity and all of its cultural assumptions in the public schools and in higher education and in society as a whole. There certainly are echoes of that today. Latz suggested that after the Scopes trial, fundamentalists formed their own schools, universities, seminaries, Bible schools, publishing houses, and fundamentalist radio stations, which, by the way, were hugely influential. They withdrew from the society as a whole. The giants of evangelical and fundamentalist educational institutions appeared then. Bob Jones University, the Dallas Theological Seminary, the Moody Bible Institute, Wheaton College. These institutions promoted Christian education from K-12 through universities, separate from the public schools. They set the stage for the Christian academies that sprang up during the post-civil rights era in the 1960s and following. If you had not had this turning inward of fundamentalists and the building of educational infrastructure, you couldn't have had the explosion of homeschooling and Christian day schools in the 1970s and 1980s, he said. You can't have schools without books. You can't have Christian schools without Christian books. Hence, the writing and publishing companies sprang up. And this fundamentalist ecosystem, parallel to the general population, now very powerful, came into being and was arguably inspired. Scopes trial. This fundamentalist infrastructure continues to be a significant force in American culture and education today. There are plenty of religion-related controversies beyond evolution. Should we have Bible courses in public schools? Should we post the Ten Commandments in public schools? As a footnote to that, there's some problems with that, because do you post the Protestant version or the Catholic version, or should you post one of the Jewish versions? I mean, there's more than one version of the Ten Commandments, so which one do you post? Should public schools hire Christian chaplains as guidance counselors? Book banning, the banning of books that contravene what they believe are Christian values. And of course, there are huge controversies in public schools regarding gender, race, and American history. A little bit earlier, I reminded you of the old adage about history not repeating itself, but rhyming. I'm hearing a lot of rhyming myself. Oh yes, I do believe that the 101-year-old trial of John Scopes is relevant today. I was supposed to have given this talk last year, but for various reasons I canceled, and Judy was kind enough to reschedule me for this year. But so it's 101 years. It's a good story, and we always need good stories, but it's also the foundation of many concerns we have today about new technology and celebrity, about education, even beyond evolution. And hopefully, Scopes can remind us of one of the most difficult things: to be aware of one's biases, ideologies, and values, and be willing to set them and your tribal identification aside when evaluating factual knowledge. Finally, Scopes is highly relevant to the growth of Protestant Christian fundamentalist religion, which crosscuts all of the above. I hope you have enjoyed this introduction to the world of John Scopes, Clarence Darrow, William Jennings Bryan, and the other colorful characters that made up the 1925 Scopes trial, and why Scopes is still relevant. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scott. That was a wonderful historical lesson, as well as bringing up the relevance of it to today. I didn't realize I was going to have to dust off my synapses there to pull up some things I hadn't discussed in quite some time.
Well, thank you for all those little applauses. I see the little hands. Thank you, my friends.
We do have a few questions, if you wouldn't mind taking them.
Absolutely. Happy to do so.
Well, it turns out you already answered half of this question that came in. So do we know if the trial was aired over radio, which we see that it was? But radio didn't really become a household item until the 30s. So, at the time of the trial, do we think this had the same kind of impact on media that, for example, the OJ trial did with regards to the growth of trial TV and a lot of true crime pursuits on television?
Of course, it's difficult to estimate the listenership of the Scopes trial, but there is, first of all, WGN had a huge broadcast base. Like I said, it was most of the Midwest, kind of all the way down to Oklahoma and all the way to Ohio. I mean, there's just this huge, one estimate that I read, which is probably a little bit high, estimated like 1/3 of the American population was tuned into this trial. I mean, it was such a big cultural deal. Um, the O.J. Simpson, they were. I'm trying to remember the statistics now. I read one place where the estimate of the people who tuned into uh, the decision in the O.J. trial was this astonishingly. Um, did I disappear? I'm seeing. Okay, I won't pay any attention. Um, it was like a third or something of American people, which is people would literally stop their cars and get out and look at television screens that were showing through windows of stores when the O.J. Simpson decision was announced. It was just nuts. Um, so we don't know for sure, but we do know from letters to the editor and other kinds of communication that it was a substantial percentage of the American population for its time. Um, Unfortunately, and this just breaks the heart of every historian and anybody who's interested in this topic. The tapes no longer exist. In fact, they didn't have tapes. Number one, this was all live broadcast. Now we do have transcripts of the trial, which is great. Just like any other trial, they were transcribers making written records, but there wasn't a way to preserve these wonderful broadcasts. So 1925. But like I say, it was the beginning of a real celebrity based flashy trial coverage trend.
So it'd be safe to say anybody outside of the footprint of WGN was following along largely through newspaper.
Newspapers, magazine, telegram too, of course. But remember, newspapers were far more numerous than they are today. Every major city had a dozen newspapers, and even small towns would have 2 or 3 newspapers, and even counties would have their own county newspaper, and everybody talked about the sculpture. You might have gotten your news a day or so later, but just imagine what it would have been like to have been in Dayton with with scores and scores of these reporters around, all trying to elbow each other aside to get to the telegraph so that they could, you know, telegraph off their stories that they were writing, so that the New York Times or the San Francisco Chronicle or whatever newspaper you were writing to would step to type and get it out for the next edition. I mean, it must have been an absolute circus.
Understood.
Fun stuff.
I have the next two questions are very similar, but on different portions of the information that you presented. So, the approach to teaching the science of eugenics,
Mhm.
its proponents in the early 20th century were, you would seem, run quite contrary to what conventional religious and political underpinnings are. Who initially raised the loudest objection to eugenics? Was it more based on religion or human right reasons?
It was both, but ideologies are very malleable, and there were a number of Christian denominations. By the way, eugenics. There were whispers of eugenics in some of the textbooks, but nothing terribly strong. But more than we would recognize it today. Think, oh, you're talking about eugenics here. You're talking about differences and quality between different human groups. Now that's not okay. But at the time, there were some Christian denominations which looked at the story of the sons of Noah Noah and his family get off the ark, and the sons of Noah and their unnamed wives, whoever those ladies were, they all went off and repopulated the world. And I think it was Ham, the son that went down and repopulated Africa. And Ham was kind of under a stigma. He was marked by his father, and the mark of Ham is generally considered dark skin. So, according to their interpretation of the Bible, there were some human groups that were inferior to others. So it was okay to enslave them, and it was okay to discriminate against them, and they should not have the same rights as others. And, ideally, you wouldn't let them reproduce. Negative eugenics. This was countered very strongly by other Christian denominations who were at the forefront of arguing for the fact that we are all, and they would argue on religious grounds as well as on moral and ethical grounds. That we were all the sons of Adam, sons and daughters of Adams, and we should not discriminate among God's children, etc. And then you get into the whole, the evolutionary. There's more stuff. Yeah, and then of course many secularists and humanists, Unitarians and the like, would very strongly oppose eugenics from a moral and ethical standpoint. Lots of ideologies can move in the same direction.
Well, maybe this next question is going in the same direction that you pulled back on there just a moment ago. So, what was the national view at the time of evolutionary theory and its teaching in the school? Did it vary widely from state to state, or was it relatively uniform across the nation?
It would vary widely because, of course, education is local in the United States. Unlike many European nations, even at the time, we do not have a national curriculum. We don't even have state curricula. Curricula is determined by the local school district. And nowadays we have guidance from the state generally in state standards and English language arts and mathematics and science and history and so forth. But at the time there was none of that. So it was really very freeform. And what the public education system was not well developed in 1925. What you did have was textbooks, and they really dominated the curriculum. If it was in the textbook, it was likely to be taught. You also did not have a very strong teacher training institution in the United States. So as a result, the quality of teachers varied enormously from place to place. But the textbook that Scopes taught from did talk about evolution, but only in the sketchiest terms. Evolution was becoming, and it was taught at the colleges and universities. And of course, the big idea of evolution is that living things have common ancestors. That's kind of overlooked because people sort of get sidetracked into mechanisms of natural selection like that. But the big idea really is we share common ancestry, and all creatures on Earth share common ancestry with each other in this sort of branching and splitting tree of life. And that sort of general idea was communicated without much detail, because there wasn't a lot of detail, frankly. I noticed that next month, where are we here? Here we go. You are having a paleontologist. This is my Edmontosaurus from the Royal Tyrrell Museum up in Canada. Do go and listen to the paleontology talk next month. There weren't very many fossils at all. There was a mad scramble to uncover dinosaurs in the West, but a whole lot of detail was known about evolution. But Darwin himself had sort of laid out the basic framework of how do we know that living things have common ancestors, and he looked at it through embryology. He looked at it through comparative anatomy. There wasn't that much embryology. There's a lot of comparative anatomy. Not much in the way of fossils. Certainly no genetics. Certainly no DNA comparisons, not like we have today. So the big idea of evolution was out there. Darwin had established that. It had been confirmed. It had been, looked at one side and tested, and yeah, pretty much everybody was on board on that. And they were largely filling in the details. But the textbooks at the K-12 level, but it would only be the high school level, They didn't teach it at all in the lower grades. K8 was black hole. But in high school, depending, of course, on your text, you might very well be taught a rudimentary form of evolution, but not like high school textbooks today, which have improved greatly, by the way, from the time when I was in high school.
Yes, I've been exposed to recent teachings now too, and it's come a long way. Would it be fair to say that in the early 1920s, then, that even though the evolution theory was developed in the 19th century, it didn't really become commonplace and well understood, and not even have the scientific backing that it does today back then?
Oh, it's just the scientific backing is just, increased with every decade, so to speak, and continues today. We are filling in more and more and more of the details. Nobody argues in the scientific community whether evolution took place. We fight like cats and dogs about what happened, who's related to whom, and the details of the stuff. But nobody argues about the whether. And of course, that is where the creationism and evolution issue comes to the fore, because there still is a it's not a large number of people, but they can be really noisy group of people in the United States who don't want their kids to be taught that you share common ancestry with non-humans. They want our species to be specially created because it's a human exceptionalism kind of thing. And we are special to God, so we have to be separate. Um, there are other Christians who don't find that a stumbling block whatsoever, that we can still be special to God, etc., even though we are part of this wider creation. But that's a theological issue that, as a humanist, I don't normally get into, but I do enjoy looking at from time to time. Yeah, I would say that there was not very much evolution at all in 1925. I mean, the fact that a chimpanzee was brought to the Scopes trial. This is the whole, I didn't come from a monkey. Of course, a chimpanzee is an ape, but I'm being pedantic here.
Yes, I laughed
This
at that point too.
the idea that I came from a monkey, and monkeys are kind of smelly creatures who throw poop at you at the zoo. This is not a very pleasant thought for most people. And of course, we didn't come from monkeys. We didn't come from apes. We came from a common ancestor with monkeys. We come from a common ancestor with rutabagas, ultimately, if you go back far enough. We share common ancestors with Neanderthals. That's more like it. And you have to go back further in time before you get where we are sharing ancestry with other primate species.
Reading another question that's come in. Do you think that people reacted so strongly against eugenics because they were genuinely concerned about the evil it represented to their viewpoint? Or could it have been more of a gut reaction against the idea of playing God with genetics, similarly to what incenses many against GMOs today, regardless of what science indicates?
I think in 1925, nobody had a very clear idea of how genetics works. Um, the let's see, when was Mendel rediscovered? He was rediscovered, I think, the late teens or early 20s. It was very late when the idea of inheritance as being a particulate phenomenon as opposed to a blending phenomenon was developed or discovered and confirmed. So the details of it were still very, very fuzzy. It was more two things. Eugenics comes in two flavors. There's positive eugenics, which is you smart, good-looking people, healthy people, you guys, find each other and have children. We'll improve the human species by having the good genes propagated at a higher level. The Nazis were really keen on this. They would have, and in the United States, actually, in the 20s and 30s, you would have these contests where what did they? Oh God, I'm trying to remember. These festivals would be held where young people would be encouraged to meet each other and get married and have lots of healthy, smart children. Then there's, and that's not it's not awful, but it's not going to be a very fast way to improve the species. It's not really going to work terribly well. But Negative eugenics is the kind that really made the hair go up on people's necks, because negative eugenics, you're saying, this group or this individual, we're not going to let them reproduce because they don't have good genes. They wouldn't say genes, but they don't have good traits, and we're not going to let them reproduce because if they do, they will spoil the germline or something like that. The Nazis were really keen on this as well, of course, as you know. But in the United States, um, the what was her name? Buck. Why can't I remember her first name? Um, well, it was not uncommon for women in the 20s and 30s to be uh, silently uh, sterilized. Um, I actually I did some research when I was a college professor at the University of Kentucky. And yeah, for some reason, a physical anthropologist ended up doing social science research in the Appalachia, but it was fun. I got to do a lot of canoeing. But anyway, we interviewed a lot of people in Appalachia, um, Morgan County, and the rest. And I got to be friends with a wonderful woman and got a little bit of her story. And she and her sister, they seemed very old to me at the time. I was in my early 30s, and they seemed to be very old. They were probably in their 50s by now. But she and her husband had not had any children. Her sister and her sister's husband had not had any children. Both of the husbands had had other wives previously and had children with the other wives. So it wasn't the guys. Nothing wrong with the sperm. But these two sisters, and they told me about how, oh yeah, the doctors would come, every couple of years, and because they lived way out in the sticks, the doctors would come and give them appendectomies because a ruptured appendix is a big deal if you don't live close to a hospital. I take that to heart because when I was 15, I had a ruptured appendix and I had gangrene. I almost died. My mother was Christian Science, but that's a long story. At any rate, I did get to the hospital. They cleaned me up, and I'm alive today, many, many years later. And so I do appreciate the value of modern medicine. And I can kind of see how that would be a plausible explanation. We're coming to take out your appendix because if you have a ruptured appendix, you might die because you can't get to the hospital in time in the big city.
I'm going to guess
At the
that the
same
appendectomies
time,
happened on both sides, though.
while you're in there close to the appendix, it's not that hard to just snip off a couple of fallopian tubes, right? And that happened with a lot of women in Appalachia who were perfectly normal. There was nothing, these were women of normal intelligence. But the assumption was made back in the 20s and 30s that oh, these poor people are dumb. If you're poor, you must not be succeeding. So if you were, even if you didn't do well in school, you sometimes were judged to be not fit, and there would be ways of figuring out how to sterilize you. So negative eugenics was certainly something that happened. That happened.
Now, you mentioned the political aspirations of William Jennings Bryan. How did the defense attorneys, how is it that the defense attorneys were so popular at that time? Were they particularly known for law in Chicago area or something nationally?
You mean Darrow?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Darrow was a national figure. Yes, Darrow had taken on some really big cases. He had defended these two young men who had killed their parents, and he was able to persuade. It was clear that they were guilty as hell, but he got them off on the grounds that they had. Wasn't it insanity defense or so? Anyway, he really had a silver tongue, and he had defended all of these unattractive characters because that was the kind of guy he was. He was a real iconoclast, but a brilliant, brilliant lawyer. Like I said, the legal the legal institution of the United States considers, and historians consider Darrow to be one of the finest legal minds ever produced in this country. So he was very well known from his high-profile cases. And he was also known as being an atheist, which, in the teens and 20s, this was not a terribly popular point of view. People are often not terribly, people who are not believers are still not popular in some sense. There are very few members of Congress, for example, who do not identify as religious, and the reason for that is unpopularity. But because he was openly irreligious and even anti-religious, that would also give him a fair amount of publicity. So yeah, there was a very big deal, and of course William Jennings Bryan was so well known. Like I say, Bryan gets a bad rap. He was really not, don't judge him by his last innings.
So it would be, did I understand correctly that this was largely a trumped up charge to get this exposure
Yeah,
via the
absolutely.
ACLU, excuse me?
Absolutely. And that was what made it's such a fun story because, you've got the prosecution and the defendant are great buds. They go off swimming together. you know, they cooked up the trial in Dayton to bring publicity to Dayton. They were, good civic boosters. And of course, they got far more than they imagined. Actually, there's many aspects to the story. One of which was that they managed to persuade one of the county judges to come out of his vacation to sign the papers to indict Scopes because they had heard a rumor that somebody in Chattanooga was trying to do the same thing. So they wanted to very quickly secure their particular plaintiff
So it was the
before
race.
somebody else did. Yep, that's right. But
Um,
yeah, the whole thing was cooked up, but it was a very um, profound case anyway. But like I said, the Butler Act remained on the books until the 1970s,
wow, didn't realize it was there that long.
76.
One last question here for you. I'll try and parse it here. It seems in the past those who opposed evolution could be swayed en masse if and only if two arguments coexisted: an argument for evolution based in science and an argument for evolution based in religious belief. And I want to throw one other thing here. I'm sorry, there must be a term for it, but I'm not aware of it. What do we call today the theory that life was brought forth by God, but that evolution parallels that? In other words, stems from whatever primordial event it is that led to life. What do we call
That's
that belief?
that is a variant of a theological view called theistic evolution, where God is involved, but basically evolution takes place. And there's various, versions of theistic evolution. One of which is that God just got the whole procedure going, and off it went. And sometimes it's according to a plan God had in mind. In other cases, he's given nature creativity to kind of go in whatever direction natural selection takes it and the environment takes it, because God loves, creativity as well. There's a lot of different theological views of how theistic evolution would work. And indeed, for most religious people, the part about evolution that they don't like, well, one part is man evolved from monkeys, and monkeys are stinky and throw poop, and that's the ick factor is in there certainly. But the other factor that is very offensive for most Christians is that you're saying God had nothing to do with it. And so evolution itself is not all that upsetting for many Christians, but if you try to, say, and therefore you have to give up your faith, most Christians are going to dig in their heels about that. And the fact of the matter is that if you are a Christian, more so than Muslim or Judaism is different. But if you are a Christian, there's tons and tons of scholarship about different Christian views of evolution. Some of them being highly accommodationist, and some of them, of course, like Christian science or like creation science, rejecting the whole concept of evolution. So
So
yeah,
if
it's
you
big.
don't believe in that theistic evolution approach, how do you square then a religious support of evolution?
Well, if you are a religious support of evolution, has to have God being involved somehow, unless it's deism. I mean, deism is the idea that you sort of push way back the creative act. That there is a supreme intelligence in the universe. Maybe, lit the fuse for the Big Bang, and then everything has been ticking along. And, um, God is not a God you can supplicate or a God that would answer prayers. The deist God, which is basically what most of the founding fathers were. They were not conventional Christians like we think of them today. They were largely deists, very very much influenced by the Enlightenment. But if generally speaking, if you are a religious person, you want a God to be in there somewhere. But it can vary hugely among different religious views as to how much God is involved. I know one Christian theologian who has worked very hard. He's a physicist and a theologian. He's worked very hard to try to accommodate chance into evolution, but still God have something to do with it. And I'm not sure how he does it, but it has something to do with subatomic forces which operate on a stochastic probability um, uh, situation of the various elements um, of the DNA, for example, and this would result in changes in the DNA and thus evolution. Therefore, God can work through chance or through design. It's it's a people who know more about Christian theology will debate those issues, and I find them very fascinating. But I can't say that I'm an expert on them by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, thank you very much for an engaging talk. I really appreciated the detail that you shared with us with regards to the mindset and the history behind it.